Adam Sitze, assistant professor of law, jurisprudence, and social thought, is delivering the annual Max and Etta Lazarowitz lecture tomorrow at Amherst College. The talk, titled Rethinking South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, will be followed by a reception. Both those events are open and free to everybody. I had the opportunity to talk with Professor Sitze recently about his upcoming lecture, and I asked him what drew him to study South Africa.
Well, I had been studying human rights abuses in Latin America as a graduate student in the 1990s, and it just seemed to me that the news was so bad so repeatedly and so little was being done to redress these abuses that the news that was coming out of South Africa at the time in the early 1990s showed an alternate model and a kind of positive, affirmative way to deal with human rights abuses and to create a new moral order for a post-conflict society.
The title is fascinating. The Impossible Machine, the genealogy of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, I know publishers often have a lot to do with that, but still, what a fascinating impossible, the impossible machine.
Well, I like your inflection. You've got it just right, because with that title, I hope to indicate what I view as a deadlock in the current debate over the Truth Commission. So in the early 1990s, and this indeed was what attracted me to the Truth Commission in the first place, people were saying this is an impossible machine. It's a machine that's going to make miracles. It's going to take a country that is basically at war with itself, because there was something like a civil war in the early 1990s in South Africa. And it's going to create peace and a post-conflict society. It's a miracle-making machine. And so in that sense, it's an impossible machine. If war machines make war, impossible machines make impossible things happen. So I think there was an initial moment of enchantment with the Truth Commission in around 95, 96, when we all kind of got fascinated by what this project would entail. And then as the kind of nitty-gritty started to unfold, there was some disenchantment that started to seep in. And then people started to say, hold on now, this impossible machine actually is an impossible machine. It's a machine that doesn't work, that misfires, that didn't produce reconciliation in the least, and that in fact has overpromised itself. So basically, the objective of my research is to move us beyond that deadlock, enchantment, disenchantment. We can do better than that.
But it just strikes me what an amazingly difficult charge this commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, had before it. Here's a nation, majority of its people had been held in absolute servitude, and that doesn't even begin to say what apartheid was like in Africa. I mean, something multiples beyond our injustices in our own American racial civil rights or non-civil rights Jim Crow system. And yet they're charged with sorting through all the atrocities, all the things that were done and that happened. Could anything like that conceivably succeed, do you think?
Well, I think that initially they were maybe a little bit, there was a euphoric moment around the mid-1990s where I do think that they overpromised. But when you look at the actual mandate of the Truth Commission, which coming out of the legislation that established it in 1995 was to establish as complete a picture as possible of the gross human rights abuses that were committed between 1960 and 1994. So indeed, that was supposed to produce a public record that would allow South Africans to reconcile with their past, to come to terms with their past, and therefore as well to reconcile with each other in the present. But that modest core, where basically the idea was to use amnesty as a kind of carrot to get people to confess their crimes and therefore to kind of receive immunity from prosecution on the one hand, and on the other hand, this attempt to give people a public space where they could speak about their suffering to a mass televised, radio broadcasted audience. I think that did have some kind of that did have some kind of almost revolutionary promise to it. So, but at the core, it was really about this very circumscribed kind of set of crimes. So let me give yet another response to this. Most people are amazed to find out that the crime of apartheid itself, which is a crime under international law, was not at issue in the Truth Commission. The only crimes that they looked at were actually crimes that were already crimes under existing South African law, like murder and torture and so forth. And so that was part of the kind of confusion as well. This commission had to work from the parts, all of these individual gross abuses of human rights, and they had to establish a picture of the whole, but without having support from the international law category.
You were also invited, certainly on the basis of your earlier work, I'm sure, and your studies, your interest, to write a chapter for the Cambridge companion to Nelson Mandela. You specifically were asked to look at his legal background. He is an attorney, as probably a lot of people forget. A chapter called Mandela and the Law for that Cambridge study. You went to South Africa. You had amazing access to archival materials. That alone had to be an amazing thing to be asked to do and an amazing thing to participate in.
It was a great honor to be given access to his personal papers by Vern Harris at the Nelson Mandela Foundation in Johannesburg. And one of the things that became immediately clear is this picture that we've been given of Mandela from this movie called Invictus, where he's kind of the distracted sports fan who's kind of wandering off in the middle of these cabinet meetings to check the rugby scores and so forth. Nothing even close to that. Nelson Mandela trained in administrative law, and he was engaged from his notes. It was very, very clear he was engaged in the most basic, granular details of the South African transition. You can go look at those papers, and he's adding up the amounts of donations he's going to get from the Saudis. How are we going to fund this revolutionary project to transform this country? But beyond that, what really stuck out is that this is somebody who began his legal studies in 1939 at the University of Fort Hare, and only in 1989, while he's still in prison, was he able to complete, via correspondence course, his LLB degree, which is their equivalent of RJD. And during that time, 50 years, he took dozens and dozens and dozens of law classes from the University of London, from the University of Witwatersrand, and then lastly from the University of South Africa. This man read and studied in that prison cell by himself in solitude for 50 years.
Is South Africa today, when you think of what it was only two and a half decades ago, change that seemed to come very suddenly, at least to those of us in other parts of the world. Suddenly the man in prison for 3 decades is the president of South Africa. You've been there not all that long ago. Is South Africa today working? You've got less than a minute to comment on that.
Well, what I would say is that this is a country whose heroes run deep. We have a generation of leaders like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and so forth. But beyond that, there are lesser-known people who have the same kind of moral integrity, the same kind of intellectual integrity. South Africa has problems. There's no doubt about that. But the more time you spend there, the more hope you get about the future of this country.
Well, Professor Adam Seitz from Amherst College, thank you so much for your time and perspective, sir.
All right. Thank you very much.